Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practice Growth HQ. Now, today we're going to talk about reducing friction. Like, if you're on this podcast because you want to grow your practice, one of the things you've got to do is stop the things that are hindering you. And a big one is friction. And you're thinking, friction? What do you mean? This is not a machine. Well, it's a machine business, isn't it? And one of the places we can have friction is in terms of building more trusting teams, kind of workplaces, so that, as it were, to continue the metaphor, the parts moved, work together more smoothly. With that in mind, we've got the perfect guest today, which is Michael Neece. Now, Michael is a seasoned leader with over 30 years of experience across 5 industries, and he teaches leaders and frontline workers to implement kindness-focused strategies. Now, there's a concept that boosts team cohesion, engagement and retention, and of course, reduce friction. All the way from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Angus. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Now, Michael, we like to start with the fast five. Quicker questions, quicker answers, so people can get to know you quickly. Question one, where did you grow up?
Northern Virginia, Fairfax.
Ah, there you go. I lived in Fairfax County for 3 years. How about that, eh? All
That's pretty
right.
cool.
It is, yes, Falls Church. All right, question two. Favorite book besides your own?
Favorite book, Have Spacesuit Will Travel by Robert Heinlein.
I definitely have not heard of that one before. Is that it's a biography of an astronaut?
It's actually more science fiction about a young kid who wins a astronaut spacesuit in a contest and then has wild, crazy adventures. Yeah.
Okay, all right, very interesting. Question three, Michael, what's one of your superpowers?
I fall a little bit in love with almost every person that I meet. I really try to understand and hear and know them.
Okay, wow, what a great superpower. Question four, something you wish your 20-year-old self knew.
That you don't have to go through all of this alone, that there are mentors and coaches and very good-willed adults who are there to help you out in your early career.
And question five, something you're grateful for.
Oh my gosh, I'm grateful for so many things. Family is the first one that comes to mind, especially my wife. She puts up with a lot.
Yes, yes. So it's going to say family gets a mention in that segment very often, which is a good reminder for all of us, isn't it? All right, our topic today is about friction, Michael, and I guess I've used the metaphor of a machine with a lot of moving parts, and indeed that's what a business is. If you've got friction among those parts, then everything slows down. Why do we experience friction in the workplace, and what is it?
Friction in the workplace is where communications and processes break down, primarily because I think, at least here in America, for sure, we are always trying to make the next deadline. We're trying to sprint and we go so quickly that we forget the niceties of work. We forget to tell people very important pieces of information so that they can function well within the business. And we just assume that they know those pieces of information. We overlook that somebody's having a hard time and so on and so on. It's really it's the breakdown of those human communications.
Okay. And friction, is it inherent? Are there things that we do that cause it? Does it just happen? Is it a case of it will be there unless you actively try to address it?
I think if we show up to work, not just strategically, but also philosophically, then I think we are much better equipped to reduce that friction. I think it's an inherent part of any business. And the more you are mindful of how you interact, what messaging you're telling everybody, what is the vision and so forth, I think the more you can conquer that friction and reduce it.
Okay. All right. The listeners are going, this sounds interesting, Michael. How do I know if I've got friction in my office?
You know that you have friction in your office if you have an email chain that goes 5 or 6 in length. You know that you have friction if somebody keeps repeating behaviors that you thought you made very clear that they shouldn't. If you have expectations that somebody is not fulfilling, even though you've had those conversations as well. And if you have customer complaints, let's be real about this. If you have somebody getting online and saying something not so flattering about your business, it's probably because they encountered friction.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had an interview, I'm not sure when they'll come out in the sequence of the podcast, but with someone recently, and we were talking about getting staff to fill in surveys once a quarter and say what they change about the business. And indeed, in my business, we get our staff to do something every week, but we also do a monthly one. And we had a meeting yesterday, and I looked through the results of the monthly survey ahead of the meeting. And one thing that's, I guess, the bigger your organization gets, the harder this is, but getting the clear message through the organization to continue our engine metaphors, the oil, the lubricant through the whole machine is really difficult. In the last month or two, we've implemented a personal development program where every single team member's had a 45-minute meeting with their supervisor, talked about their hopes and their dreams and their wishes and so on. Well, one of the survey questions was words to the effect of how actively do you think your employer cares about your future development? And we've got a few answers there that are like neither agree nor disagree. And I'm like, what? We've just implemented this program across the whole thing. Your supervisor sat there for 45 minutes. It's all about you. How could that message not be getting through? It's very easy for you and I to talk about this, Michael, but it's not easy to achieve, is it?
No, not at all. I think one of the problems is that we think sometimes talking at everybody else on the team informs them. And what I have found, every single industry that I've been part of, every different role that I've been part of, the more listening the leaders do, the more effective they are. I think the surveys, that is an excellent start. That is a great way of trying to get inside the head and the heart of each of the employees that are part of that organization. So if it's that big machine, it's almost like you're inspecting every part. But what I find is that if you're doing the listening, then you are saying, okay, what feels confusing? What feels like you've asked the question before and you haven't gotten the answer that you really need? Asking those kinds of questions, leading questions where you don't interject very much, I find that those can actually be really effective, those kinds of conversations.
Okay, let's say that the listeners, including me, we recognize there's friction in the organization. What do we need to do to try and reduce this? Because we don't want a kind of an anchor on our efforts at moving forward and growing our practice. What do we need to do?
Some simple tools that I always use that I really love. If you have a team meeting, do a round robin. Make sure that every single person has an opportunity to speak, and make sure that it's early in the meeting so that everybody has a chance to share something, because research shows that the earlier somebody has an opportunity to speak within some kind of session, whether it's a class session or it's a training or it's a meeting, the earlier they have some opportunity to speak and they do speak, the more they will speak, the more they will give opinions and ask those questions that they need to ask. So I love doing a round robin, and I love making sure it has nothing to do with work. So round robins that I love to do are, what are you grateful for today? You have 1 minute and you can share anything, and you can talk about, oh, my anniversary is coming up next week. I can't believe I've been married for 9 years. My garden is finally starting to grow the vegetables that I thought I'd never be able to grow. Those kinds of things humanize us to each other. It reveals the connections that we didn't know that we had. Oh, you like to do cosplay and dress up as Deadpool. I like to cosplay and dress up as Wolverine. Suddenly you have connections on the team that nobody expected. And so I love doing that. I think that's a great way of reducing friction. It sounds counterintuitive because if you have 15 teammates, you're taking 15 minutes. But in fact, you're actually bonding and you're getting people more likely to speak up. Some of the other things to do is to coach people. If you are starting an email, and a 5-minute phone call would save you 20 minutes of crafting the perfect email with all of the correct emotions, and do the 5-minute phone call. And then that way you have a chance to have an exchange as opposed to talking at somebody the whole time. So those are just two off the cuff suggestions that I found work really well.
Okay, I've got questions about both of them. So you say
Sure.
the research shows get them talking early because they're more likely to engage and so on. Does that mean that they'll just engage at that time, or it opens the lid for them to be engaging and talking through the entire meeting? Is that true?
If you go with the Brené Brown model of trust building, which
Mm,
is you have a marble jar, and every time somebody does something to build trust with you, you put a new marble in,
mm,
right? And every time somebody does something that breaks a bit of trust, you pull one marble out, possibly pouring out the entire jar, depending on what the offense was.
mm,
Um, if you are putting these marbles in during one meeting, and then you put in a few more during a training session, and then you do a little bit more during a professional development session, and so on, eventually those marbles get to the point where these people feel very comfortable telling you things that you may not want to hear, but that you really need to hear. When we keep people waiting in our waiting room for more than 17 minutes, oh my gosh, they start to get a little bit batty. They start to go bananas. So
mm.
we need to have some way of keeping them happier there, or we need to reduce that time. Gosh, you would never hear that message from somebody who is afraid
Yeah.
of delivering messages to you if saying such things are going to cause friction and consternation between you and that teammate.
Yeah, and it's fair to say in healthcare, and I notice your bio says you've worked across 5 industries, but I would say there would be, except for maybe the armed forces, there'd be few industries that would be more hierarchical than healthcare. In many ways, there's this perceived chasm, not true in every workplace, but between the healthcare professional who's gone and done the hard yards and then the support staff who, I suppose it's mainly about education, the amount of education they've got, but sometimes the experience as well. Now, the other thing you mentioned was the phone call versus the email chain. Of
Right.
course, what you're saying sounds like a great idea, Michael, but there's I would say at least one and probably two generations who are like, no, you don't understand. I don't talk on the phone.
Right.
Um, a friend of mine who's got kids about the same age as me made a very interesting observation, which is that our kids own phones, but never
Mhm.
actually talk on them. Like it's
Right.
very rare for me to hear either of my kids actually speaking on the phone. They do lots of messaging, they'll play games and stuff, but actually the speaking part is quite foreign. So I get that on the one hand, we're like, come on, let's just get on the phone and get this thing sorted. And that would be my approach, but then I'm in my 50s. For me, that's not such an unusual thing. How do you get that across if you've got a bunch of millennials working for you?
There is a great comedy series that used to be here in the United States called Key and Peele. And they did a sketch where somebody sends a text and says, "Hey, are you going to be here soon?" And the other person reads it a certain way, and back and forth and back and forth. And that one of them is getting irate and upset to the point where he shows up at the bar with a baseball bat to hit his supposed friend. And his supposed friend is there and just like, "Hey, buddy, oh, and you brought me a bat. This is great." You know, I think one of the key pieces where I have had to train people who are in their 20s and trying to convince them that you don't know how I mean something if you can't see my face
Right.
and if you don't know what my body language is. Coaching them and getting them that research so that they understand you can't get alignment beyond about 7% of the time if all you have are words.
Mm,
As soon as you have tone of voice, as soon as you have facial expressions, as soon as you have body language,
mm,
now you're conveying all of the other pieces that are not visible otherwise. So while texting is what my children would rather do,
yeah.
what they rapidly learn is that people can misinterpret those so quickly. So if you're one of the young listeners to this podcast, I would encourage you to think of times when somebody's misinterpreted you and your tone because all they had were words. And to consider it is good to get on the phone. And if being on the phone is scary, then actually video can be a little bit less scary for the modern generation. They're a little bit more
Mm,
comfortable with that.
okay.
And so I would say lean into that piece or walk to the other person's office if that's possible for you to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I suppose my thought is just because a generation that's their sort of preference, it doesn't mean that you can't sit down and say, look, I understand that's what you prefer to do, but at this workplace, in certain circumstances, I need you to get on Zoom or pick up the phone or whatever. I will admit to you that for me, there are times I don't want to get on the phone either. There are times I don't want to talk to anybody at all. There was a guy I heard, it's a book I read a couple of years ago. He was talking about alter ego, where you put on this persona, try on this persona. And basically, the idea was that at times, it's almost, I think you referenced some Marvel characters before. It's almost, look, for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to put on my Captain America suit, metaphorically, whoever it is. I must admit, for me, it was Matthew McConaughey, this kind of laconic, easygoing, but very confident sort of person. And it's almost like, that's fine. Like for the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to imagine that I'm more that part of my personality. And then
Sure.
if that's what I've got to do to get the job done, that's what I'm going to do, even though there are times I don't want to talk on the phone for possibly an entire day or two. So there you go. All right, Michael, friction. Other ways we can do, we've got some really nice little tidbits. I think if you've got 15 staff and it's a minute each, that is a significant investment of time. But you're saying we need to hear from everyone.
If you've hired somebody, then they have to have a voice. There is a reason. They have a skill set, they have experience and background, they have those soft skills or the technical skills. They have something. And not hearing from them is dangerous.
Mm.
Because one of the problems is that if I have a message that I really need you to hear, Angus, then I don't have an opportunity to give you that message. Now I'm starting to wonder if I belong. And that is one of the most dangerous things in any team, is the sense that I don't belong here. I'm not part of the team. I'm not valued. And so 15 minutes out of a 40-hour work week, or 50 or 60, depending on what you do,
Yeah.
15 minutes is so easy. And I would temper it. If you think a round robin really needs to be a half minute each, then do that. But
Right.
even within a half minute, you still get some sort of buy-in from everybody in the room. Otherwise, are they showing up because they feel they belong and they're part of your purpose?
Mm.
Or are they showing up for a paycheck? And they're showing up and they're a little bit fearful? That you don't want that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Some more techniques. I can see how this one could work. I will admit what we've started to do is we have a weekly team meeting, and we usually do a sort of a 5 or 10 minute quiz at the start, and we share it among the team members who does that. I suppose it's quite possible that you'll have people who are not participating there, and they're not necessarily sharing what they think or how they feel, but I must say the engagement's usually been pretty good, but I think the one you're mentioning is definitely worth trying. What are some other things that listeners can do to reduce friction amongst the team?
One of my other favorite things to consider is the favorite person practice. I love this one because let's say that you are interacting with a client, somebody who is really unhappy for some reason. Probably it has nothing to do with you. It probably has nothing to do with the kinds of services that you provided. They could just be having a really bad day, or they could be worried about a family member who's particularly ill, or that they had an argument with, or something like that. So you now have this person in front of you, and the favorite person practice is very simple. Envision somebody who's your favorite person.
Mm.
You don't have to answer. But for those of you who are listening in, it could even be your cat. It doesn't really matter who that favorite person is. As long as it's somebody that when you think of them, you feel great love.
Mm.
You feel great affection. You feel safe. You feel like you can communicate with them and there are no penalties for being honest.
Mm.
Superimpose that face on the face of the person you're interacting with.
Mm.
Right? Now, suddenly, if this person is yelling at you, you're saying to yourself, why is my mom yelling at me? This is so weird for her. She doesn't usually do that.
Mm.
Right? Why is my cousin telling me this thing? Whoever your favorite person is, you are now curious. You are now compassionate. You are now trying to lean into that other person's world enough to understand it so that now you can diffuse the bomb, so to speak.
Mm.
And there were no explosive fireworks in the meantime. Eventually, once you've done this practice enough times, you have to have that favorite person handy. You have to know who they are so you can immediately do it. But over time, after you've done this with 3 or 4 different situations, you find that you don't even need to do it anymore. And some of the spin-off effects are that you've reduced the friction now with your clientele or with some staff member who's really upset about something. You've reduced that friction, but now you also have reasons to be happy in your life because you're thinking about your favorite person. And so it makes you more likely to call them up, which puts you into a better mood, and so on and so forth. So it's that ripple effect of I'm showing this person kindness in this very strategic way. And now it has ripple effects for both of us and everybody beyond.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I'm listening to that. Look, my granddaughter's just been staying with us the last couple of days. She's 6. And so it wouldn't be difficult for me at all to be able to superimpose her. Like our final activity together was we wrote a little song together, which she performed in front of the family. And
Nice.
and then proceeded to ask them if they wanted her autograph.
It's so wonderful. Yeah, it's those treasured moments that make you feel so good about life that if you can relive, like if you see that face in that moment with a difficult person, you're now conjuring up these warmer feelings.
Oh, totally.
You're diffusing the idea that this is somehow about you. It probably isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can see in that situation, someone's really mad at me, and then imagine myself speaking to Willow. Not that I'm going to be patronizing, but it's, oh, look, how can I help you? Help me understand what's going on. This is terrible. I can just immediately see just a lot of empathy and wanting to help them. And I know when people they express a lot of emotion, get a bit angry or whatever, that sometimes they don't actually want resolution per se. Sometimes they just want to get some steam off and say, this whole business is crap and you're crap and it's really, you show that empathy and at some level, they're going, my goodness, this person's actually listening to me. Because sometimes the frustration is they just want to be heard. So that's an interesting one. Okay. All right. So we've got I'm just going to start to list off these techniques. We've got the round robin, depending on the size of your team. I must admit, one of my teams is quite big. I'll have to figure out how to do that, Michael. But I like the sentiment, that kind of, and certainly what are you grateful for? We have win for the week, which is something similar. But I think I've often said to the guys, I say, I don't care if you win for the week's personal and professional. If you got a win in your private life, like we'll celebrate that too.
Of course. Yeah.
I'm trying to think, somebody got a new puppy recently, so that was their win. Now, there was one you mentioned in the middle. We've just talked about the favorite person practice. We had the kind of round robin. There was one that we touched on briefly that you mentioned.
It's the going more direct in your communications. So if it's
that's
email,
right. Pick up the phone. Yeah.
Then pick up the phone. And if it's phone, you can do video. And if it's video, you can try to go in person, but it's trying to get closer to the other person.
Yeah. Maybe one other technique.
One other technique is self-care. I know that it sounds done to death, but I really have to lean into this because about 2 years ago, I had a stroke. I was 50 at the time. That's an awfully early time in life to have a stroke, but It's because I was just going. I was writing a book. I was, raising 3 teenagers and so on. If you are not taking great care of yourself and kindness is your superpower, you have nothing to draw from if your own battery is nil, right? You have to keep on recharging that superpower. Otherwise, you can't spread the kindness out into the world and reduce the friction. Imagine showing up to one of these meetings where you are extremely tired and you haven't had time to prep, but you're the person in charge of the agenda. Wow, talk about building some friction. That is a huge amount of friction. And also it breaks a little bit of the trust.
Yeah.
It's in 2 ways. It's in the way of this person is not prepared the way that they should be, but it's also this person is role modeling overwork. This person is role modeling some unhealthy behaviors for themselves, even though we're supposed to be caring for the health of everybody else. When's the last time you went for a walk? When's the last time you had enough sleep and stayed hydrated and all of those things?
Yeah, no, it's worth repeating about the self-care. Look, the truth is, Michael, ahead of this podcast and Australian time, we started recording this at 9 a.m. because Michael's in the US and I'm in Australia. That's where the overlap is. Like, I was very conscious of how I show up for this podcast, even to the extent that last night I was like, I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to lift a few weights and I need to have breakfast and have a shower. And also, I don't want to jump out of the shower 2 minutes before the podcast starts because my head's not here. So I'd gone to the trouble of actually reminding myself about Michael's background, having a look through his bio, thinking, what are the things that the listeners are going to want? Which means that when I'm here with you, I can be 100% here with you. I'm not thinking about taking the cat to the vet or any of that other stuff. I'll tell you the one thing that helps enormously is just having something to write things down on. I've got some post-it notes here in a pen, which means if one of those other thoughts does pop into my mind, I can write down one or two words, then it's gone, and then I'm back and fully present again. Look, one of my favorite authors, Michael, a guy called Patrick Lencioni, who writes these books in this marvelous business fable. It just reads like a novel. It's so easy to read as a novel, and there's some business principles. One of his better-selling books is called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And he mentions that one of the dysfunctions is this lack of trust. And you've alluded to this a number of times. And his antidote is basically what you've described. It's not just that we're getting people to talk in the round robin, it's actually that we're learning about them. And he says one of the things that the trust is low because we actually don't know the people that we work with that well. So I know at times you could certainly start with what you're grateful for. That's a really simple one. But you could do just stuff like favorite thing to do when you're a kid. And as you start to get to know people better, we've said share something that no one here knows about you. And yeah, it's interesting what turns up there. I must admit to some of our team members in the Philippines, and these guys share a lot more readily than we would in Australian culture. No one's ever admitted to murdering anyone, but we've had some pretty frank admissions. I never thought this would happen, Michael, but one of them said, I haven't had sex in 5 years.
It's healthy to get these things out. It is. Yeah.
It is. Yes, it was, as I said, more than I had expected. But I think nevertheless, when you start to say, what was your favorite hobby when you were a kid, or maybe one thing we didn't know about you, then it's, oh, I didn't know that about you, Jenny, Jimmy, Ashok, whatever. And then it just becomes this, I've got a bit more of a connection with this person, and therefore that trust goes up and the friction goes down.
And the trust, just to jump in and just say, I think that's it. That's everything, because business is sets of people trying to help each other. And if you forget about the people and you're just sprinting toward, we've got to get this new product out. If that is the only thing that is on your mind, you are trampling people in the meantime. So it's that trust that makes it possible for them to say, hey, you're going a little fast and you stepped on me. And that's, yeah, I love the exercise that you have. Tell us something that nobody knows, or what's your favorite thing to do as a kid? Those are the moments where people can now speak up when the deadline gets to be a little too hot and they need you to hear something. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, look, there's lots of pretty innocuous things you can share. How many siblings have you got? Again, chances are someone else in the group's got the same number of siblings as you. Maybe you come from a big family and so do they. Maybe you're an only child and so are they. So there's lots of these very simple things. Michael, unfortunately, we're running out of time. For people who want to learn more about you or get in touch, what should they do?
Go to ourfutureiskind.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn quite often. You'll see me posting about kindness and team building and those sorts of things. And I love hearing from people and getting great suggestions, especially.
Okay. Ourfutureiskind.com.
Perfect.
That's great. It's very easy. I don't even need to spell that one. Everybody knows how that works. That's great. Look, thank you so much for your time, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Angus, it was a joy.
All right, everyone, we've covered quite a bit there, haven't we? And I think all of us recognize inherently that friction can happen in our business. Sometimes it's just the nature of people working with people. But we've covered quite a lot of strategies. As I like to say to you every week, it's not knowledge that's power, it's applied knowledge that's power, which begs the question, what's one thing you can do as a result of what you heard today? Make sure you go and implement that before you go on to the next thing. Finally, if you got some value from our time together today, then please head to where you're hearing this show and leave us a lovely review to give us the encouragement to bring you more great content every week on Practice Growth HQ.